Okay, so I want you to just picture the scene for a second. On one side of a table, you have like the absolute archetype of the gruff, progressive politician.
Right.
The hair is a little wild, the suit's probably a bit rumpled, and he's holding an actual stack of papers about, the decline of the American middle class. That's Senator Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, the man who launched 1,000 mitten memes, the voice of the American enough for, what, decades now?
Exactly. And then sitting right across from him is this guy with a mullet. He's maybe wearing a neon vest. And he's famous for these rambling, hilarious stories about people from his hometown.
Oh, Theo Vaughn.
Theo Vaughn. It's a pairing that sounds like a fever dream.
Or maybe the setup to a really weird joke. A socialist and a comedian walk into a podcast studio.
It does. But we're looking at their recent conversation today because, surprisingly, it just works. It's not just two different aesthetics colliding. It's these two worldviews that somehow manage to go incredibly deep.
It's arguably one of the most interesting political conversations of the year because it just strips away all of that usual, cable news gloss.
It really does. And for this deep dive, we're not just looking at the novelty of it. We're unpacking a conversation that, it starts with light banter about Leonard Cohen songs.
And youth choirs in New York City, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But it pivots so fast to some of the heaviest topics you can imagine.
We're talking about the collapse of the American healthcare system, the rise of what he calls a literal oligarchy, and then a segment on artificial intelligence that is, frankly, kind of terrifying.
It's this sci-fi warning, but it's being delivered by an 83-year-old senator. And he doesn't talk about it like a politician. He talks about it like a grandfather who is genuinely scared for what's coming next.
So our mission today is to pull out the core arguments Sanders is making, specifically about the American worker, healthcare, and the future of labor. And we also want to keep an eye on how Theo Vaughn, who really represents that regular guy perspective, is reacting to it all.
Yeah, because Theo's reactions are actually key to understanding why this message connects with people who might not, normally listen to Bernie Sanders.
And to get the vibe, you have to know where Sanders' head was at right before this interview. He wasn't on some polished studio tour.
No, he'd just come from a picket line.
With the New York nurses.
Yeah.
And that sets the tone for everything, because usually when you hear picket line, you think, okay, pay dispute, inflation, wages.
More money, yeah.
But Sanders told Theo that wasn't the main thing he was seeing.
No, and this is a really crucial point. He describes these nurses coming into his office and literally just, breaking down in tears.
And it wasn't about the money.
Not primarily. The real emotional trigger was that they felt they couldn't fulfill their calling.
That's this idea of moral injury, right? When you know what a patient needs, but the system just stops you from providing it.
Exactly. They were talking about safe staffing ratios.
Okay, let's break that down for a second, because safe staffing ratios sounds like some kind of, bureaucratic jargon. What does that actually mean on the hospital floor?
It's the number of patients that one single nurse is responsible for at any given time. And Sanders paints this really vivid picture. If you're a nurse and you're trying to juggle, say, 10 patients,
Okay.
and one of them suddenly codes, meaning they go into cardiac arrest and need immediate all-hands-on-deck attention,
Yeah.
you physically cannot help the other 9.
You can't be in two places at once. So while you're saving patient A, patient B, who just needs pain medication or help getting to the bathroom, is completely ignored.
Right. So you have these nurses going home every night with this feeling that they neglected someone. Not because they're bad at their jobs, but because the math just doesn't work.
And this is where Sanders does that classic Sanders thing. He takes that heartbreaking story and immediately zooms out to show you the villain. He starts naming names.
He literally pulls out a list. He calls out Brendan Carr, Brian Donnelly. These are hospital CEOs. And he's just reading off their salaries. We're talking $15 million, $26 million a year.
For running a nonprofit hospital system, that's a staggering amount of money.
It is. And the disconnect he's highlighting is just brutal. You have the frontline workers crying because they can't keep patients safe, and the person at the very top is making $26 million.
He also mentions they're spending millions on traveling nurses, these expensive temporary contractors, instead of just hiring enough permanent staff.
Exactly. It's this inefficiency that's born from greed.
And this is where Theo Vaughn jumps in with something that I think everyone can relate to. He talks about the stress of just existing in this healthcare system.
Yeah, Theo calls it pathetic. He talks about the hours you spend on the phone with an insurance company, just begging for coverage, trying to figure out if your doctor is even in network.
He connects that stress we all feel as consumers to the stress the nurses are under. The whole thing feels designed to give you anxiety.
which just tees up Sanders for his big systemic argument. He drops a statistic that, honestly, it sounds fake. He asks Theo to guess how much the U.S. spends per person on healthcare.
And the number is $15,000 per person per year.
So for a family of 4, you're looking at a theoretical $60,000 a year just to keep them healthy. That is more than the median income in a lot of states.
And Sanders points out this is double what other major countries spend.
Double. And here's the kicker. Even though we're spending double, we have 85 million Americans who are either uninsured or underinsured.
Let's define underinsured really quick. That's when you have insurance, but your deductible is so high you can't actually afford to use it, right?
Precisely. You have the card, but it's basically useless because you don't have $5,000 in cash to pay before the insurance even kicks in.
And he brings up the Canada comparison.
Right. He says he lives only 50 miles from the border. And in Canada, you can be in the hospital for a month, have major heart surgery, and you walk out paying nothing, a zero balance.
Now, this is where most politicians would say the system is broken. But Sanders, he takes a different tack.
Yeah, that's a key insight. He says the system isn't broken at all.
It's working perfectly.
It's working perfectly,
Okay.
depending on who you are. His argument is that if your goal is to provide health care as a human right, then yeah, it's a total failure. But if your goal is to make zillions in profit for insurance and drug companies, then it's a roaring success.
It's designed to extract wealth, not to heal people. That's a chilling way to put it.
It is. It's not a bug, it's a feature.
And that idea bleeds right into the next big topic they covered, which is the broader economy. Because Sanders argues the whole economy is basically running on that same playbook.
This is where we get into wealth inequality. He hits Theo with that statistic. 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck.
In the richest country in the history of the world, that means one flat tire, one sick kid, and you are completely underwater.
Exactly. And then he contrasts that with the wealth gap. He says the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 93%. But the stat that really seemed to land, the one that made Theo kind of pause, was about Elon Musk.
Oh, the one-man stat.
Sanders claims that one man, Musk, owns more wealth than the bottom 52% of American households combined.
Okay, and I want to pause here because this is where the conversation gets really interesting. Usually people just sort of nod along when Sanders goes on this run, but Theo actually pushed back a little.
He did. He played devil's advocate, which was important. He brings up guys like Larry Ellison or Musk and says, hey, they created Tesla, Oracle, Amazon. They had a vision. Don't they deserve some wealth for creating all those jobs?
It's the classic American dream argument, right? If you invent the next big thing, shouldn't you get rich from it?
And Sanders makes a crucial distinction here. He doesn't say all money's bad. He says, look, I don't begrudge people making money. If you write a great book or invent a great product, go buy a nice house, go buy a nice car.
So what's the line for him? Where does it cross over?
It's the scale. It's the accumulation of hundreds of billions of dollars while people can't feed their families. But more than the money itself, it's about the power that money buys. This is where he brings up the concept of an oligarchy.
Oligarchy. I mean, that's a word we usually associate with, like, Russia.
Right, but Sanders applies it directly to the U.S. He argues that once you have that much wealth, you're not just a citizen anymore. You're a separate class that can actually override democracy.
He points to Citizens United. We hear that term all the time. Can we just quickly unpack what that actually is?
Sure. So Citizens United is a 2010 Supreme Court decision. And in really simple terms, the court ruled that political spending is a form of protected speech. So corporations and unions can spend unlimited money on ads.
So money equals speech. If I have $1 billion, I have 1 billion times more speech than the person working at the grocery store.
That is exactly Sanders' argument. He says that this just allowed billionaires to buy elections. He mentions Musk spending, what, $270 million to help elect Donald Trump?
And he contrasts that super PAC model, where you just call 10 of your rich friends for $30 million each, with this local example that he clearly loves.
Zoran Mamdani.
Yeah, in New York City.
Sanders was so inspired by this guy. He started at 1% in the polls for a mayoral race, refused all corporate money, and instead got 90,000 volunteers to go out and knock on doors.
So he uses that to show there is an alternative. You can fight money with people. But, and this is a big but, even with that little glimmer of hope, the conversation took a much, much darker turn.
Yeah, we have to talk about the AI segment.
This was the part that surprised me the most. I mean, Sanders has his stump speech, he plays the hits, but on this, he sounded genuinely shaken. He admits he is very, very concerned about AI.
And he's not just, an old man yelling at a cloud. He's listening to the tech leaders themselves.
Yeah.
He quotes Elon Musk saying working will be optional. He quotes Bill Gates saying humans won't be needed.
And the head of Anthropic saying half of all entry-level jobs could just disappear.
And if you connect that back to the bigger picture, Sanders is asking this fundamental question. If tens of millions of jobs just vanish in the next decade,
Right.
truck drivers, coders, writers, even some nursing tasks, what happens to the people who did those jobs?
Theo brings up UBI, Universal Basic Income, this idea that the big companies might give people some kind of stipend to live on.
And Theo had this funny, but also kind of sad image of getting like 1/11th of a Rubik's Cube every 2 weeks.
Which just highlights the absurdity of relying on corporate charity. Sanders points out that these billionaires aren't investing hundreds of billions into AI because they care about the working class. They're doing it for profit.
And if they don't need workers anymore, why would they pay to feed them?
It's not just the economic threat either. Sanders went full-on sci-fi horror. He brought up 2001, A Space Odyssey.
The HAL 9000 scenario. He mentions talking to Jeffrey Hinton, the godfather of AI, who quit Google just so he could warn people. The fear is that if an AI absorbs all of human knowledge, every book, every formula, it might eventually see humans as an impediment to progress.
Like, we're just bugs in the system that need to be cleaned up. Sorry, Dave, I can't let you do that.
Exactly. But he also grounded this in a very immediate physical reality. We think of AI as being in the cloud, like it's magic. But he brought up the data centers.
These huge server farms.
They're a massive drain on resources. They're sucking up water in local communities for cooling, and they are driving up electricity bills for everyone. Sanders is actually proposing a moratorium on new data centers.
A moratorium. A complete freeze on building them. That's a huge proposal.
It is. But his argument is basically, let's just take a breath. We are moving at a revolutionary speed with nobody at the wheel.
So what's the solution? If the robots take the jobs, do we all just starve?
Well, he offers a kind of utopian alternative to that nightmare. He says if AI increases productivity by, say, 50 or 100%, the benefit shouldn't just go to the guy who owns the robot.
Right. If a robot is doing my old job, why am I still working 40 hours a week somewhere else just to survive?
Exactly. Sanders suggests, well, maybe we work 20 hours a week for the same pay. The increased productivity from the robots pays for our leisure time. Technology could liberate us, but only if the political system forces it to.
It's a race between a Star Trek future and, well, a Blade Runner future.
And they also touched on the social cost. This idea of young people turning to AI for companionship instead of actual humans.
That part was really sad, the idea that it's easier to talk to a chatbot than to deal with the messiness of a real relationship.
It connects back to that theme of alienation. Whether it's the nurse who can't care for patients or the kid talking to a bot, the system seems to be stripping away our humanity.
Now, they didn't just stay in the future. They pivoted to some very current, very real global conflicts.
Yeah, they moved into foreign policy, specifically Israel and Gaza.
And Sanders had to walk a very fine line here. He started by acknowledging the October 7th atrocities by Hamas. He was very clear. He called them a terrorist organization.
But he was just as unequivocal about Israel's response. He called the killing of tens of thousands and the starvation of children war crimes. He heavily criticized U.S. funding for Netanyahu, essentially saying, we are funding a war criminal.
And from there, they shifted to Saudi Arabia, which was interesting because it tied all the way back to that billionaire discussion.
It did. They talked about the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
The journalist who was dismembered inside a Saudi embassy.
A brutal, state-sanctioned murder. And Sanders points out the hypocrisy of the U.S. rolling out the red carpet for MBS, the Saudi leader, even though our intelligence says he ordered that hit.
And he questions why figures like Trump and Musk seem so aligned with Saudi interests.
He suggests it's an affinity for authoritarianism. He sees this pattern where certain leaders prefer a system where dissent is crushed, the press is silenced, and a few people hold all the wealth. It's the oligarchy theme on a global scale.
Which brings us back home to immigration, because Theo brought up the ICE raids.
And Sanders admitted border security was weak. He didn't shy away from that. But he defended the undocumented workers who were here, citing their work in meatpacking plants during COVID, people who died keeping the food supply running.
He called Trump's expanded funding for ICE immigration and customs enforcement a domestic military operation.
That phrase really stood out. He sees it as an intimidation tactic, dragging people out of their homes, out of their cars. It connects back to that theme of force being used against the powerless.
And finally, to cap off this whole tour of systemic failure, they touched on the two-tier justice system.
The Jeffrey Epstein discussion.
Yeah, you can't really talk about the rich and powerful abusing the system without talking about Epstein.
And Sanders argues that this just highlights a fundamental break in the social contract. If you're poor, you get arrested for a minor offense, your life is ruined. If you're a billionaire, you can commit horrific acts with children and just rely on your money and connections to escape any real consequences.
It's that feeling that the rules are just suggestions for the rich, but they're iron bars for everybody else.
It's exactly.
So, if we try to pull this all together, we've covered healthcare, oligarchs, AI, doomsday, global conflicts, a broken justice system. I mean, it feels heavy. It's overwhelming.
It is heavy. But the synthesis, really, is about the system versus the person.
Yeah.
Whether it's a nurse crying about staffing ratios, a worker fearing a robot, or a voter watching a billionaire buy an election, the theme is powerlessness.
The game is rigged. Sanders keeps coming back to that.
But, and this is why he's still so relevant, he insists on hope. He refuses to be a doomer. He uses that example, Zohran Mamdani in New York, to show that when people organize, they can beat the money. He thinks the car is heading for a cliff, yes, but he believes we can still grab the wheel.
It's a fascinating duality, the veteran politician who sees the cliff edge so clearly but just refuses to give up.
Precisely.
So here's a thought to leave you with, and it's something that really stuck with me from that AI discussion. Sanders and Theo talked about Elon Musk's vision where work becomes optional. On paper, that sounds great. You know, you're gardening while a robot does all the hard labor.
But that assumes the benefits of that labor get shared.
Exactly. If the political system is bought and paid for by the people who own the robots, and the justice system protects those owners, what happens to the 60% of people living paycheck to paycheck when the paycheck just stops? Does optional work mean freedom, or does it just mean you're obsolete?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.